In 1936, unemployment in Britain stood at 13.9%. Swathes of industrial northern England, Wales and Scotland were affected, suffering extreme poverty. Bert Wilson is a young labourer from Hull, a bustling port city on Yorkshire's east coast. He makes his way down to London, searching for work. 2 years later, he sits in war-torn Catalonia, bombed from the air by Nazi and Italian planes, as international volunteers and troops loyal to Spain's democratic government fight to push back the forces of General Franco across the Ebro River. On small line pages, Bert neatly fills out Spanish forms detailing why he'd come to fight. His answer, in block capitals, "I'm an anti-fascist, parental influence." Bert would return home from Spain in December 1938 to live a quiet life in Hull, meeting his wife and raising his children before his untimely death in the 1970s. He was, as his boss at JT Scotland Structural Engineers wrote in 1962, a man whose integrity is beyond question. I want to better understand this extraordinary life, and to learn how Spain's civil war stretched into the heart of working class communities across the British Isles. My journey begins with Bert's son, Barry, at his home in Hull.
My dad's name was Bernard Wilfred Wilson. He was born 1918 on the 16th of the 9th, 1918. He passed his exams to go to college, quite a big thing then. And his stepmother decided that he'd been at school long enough and he needed to get out and get a job. He left school, went to work, and then he went down to London. But he went to London and he was working in a hotel there. I believe he was about 16 years old, 17. And we believe by the information that's where he probably joined up.
In London?
In London, yeah. That's why there was so little information in all about him. Generally, from what I really remember as a young man, was myself, my dad, very forthright, didn't suffer fools. If he had anything to say, he told them, and that included like social and work-wise.
Was your dad quite politically active when you were growing up still?
I can't remember it too well, but I can remember it must have had something to do with the Communist Party. We used to get visits from the police demanding to speak to him, because his affiliation, and he was stood on the doorstep. They never asked,
And when your dad went to Spain, he didn't go, did he, as Bert or Bernard? He actually went under a different name.
Leslie.
Yeah.
He went under his brother's name, Leslie, and obviously whatever documentation he needed, it took was Leslie.
Growing up, do you remember any sort of anecdotes about Spain? Is there any little things you can remember?
Yeah, the thing I remember most, if he'd been out for a jar, would sit and talk to us, and he used to sing the song Red River Valley. He would sing that. Valley in Spain called Urama. He would sing that.
For a little bit of context, Barry's describing how Bert used to sing a song about the Battle of Jarama, where 139 British volunteers were killed, adapted from the popular song Red River Valley.
And he always used to say to us, if we win that £54,000, which was the big prize in Littlewood polls, he said, you'll be speaking Spanish in a year. His actual love of what used to come through to me was, although it was there at a time like it was, which is obviously very, vicious and what have you, but he said he would have gone back if he could get the money, And at the time, as a youngish fella, he struggled to get work. I think there was quite a little bit of blackballing went on, He would have a job for a couple of days and then he'd be asked to leave. When they found out about his beliefs or his affiliations, it wasn't like you went to Spain, did you? There was no, it was more a black mark, if anything,
And when he came back from Spain, did he, because the Second World War was just beginning and obviously Hull was blitzed so badly, did he end up in the British Army or did he fight in the Second World War?
He didn't, because he'd had, obviously, whatever happened to him in Spain, he'd had somewhere where he'd been hit with a rifle and it had busted his ear. So he was deaf at one side, and everything, obviously, all went against you, didn't it, and so that was that side of it. That's why I think, otherwise he would, because he used to talk about the meeting of when the fascists came to Hull. He used to talk about that in the respect that, not much detail, but how they'd sort of run them out of town, if you like. So he had his beliefs. He believed in his unions and one thing and another, and that's what he stuck by. And I think that's where his strength came from later.
How did you sort of get an interest in your dad's story and
I mean, never been taught it at school. I didn't know my dad had been to Spain till he started talking to me when he thought I would understand, about 12, 13. He'd tell me the odd story. I mean, he told me of, they'd gone into one village and they said, he said to me, the stench, the smell, he said it was overwhelming. And he said that they were all fearing the worst, thinking people had been slaughtered. And what it was, when they got into the village, in the little square, all the bulls had been killed, for the bullfights, all the bulls, and they were just left rotting in a pile. And he said it was stuff like that it vivid, and he remembered. Dad didn't talk about it that much. They did a play about, and I always remember when I went to see it won the words they used in the play. They said his name first, Sir Bert Wilson, and they'd been going through the volunteers and all. And he said Bert didn't talk about the war, which he didn't, very little.
A few months before we met, Barry and his family had been on an extraordinary journey to northern Catalonia. Hidden in a farmhouse, an anti-fascist mural drawn by Bert during the Civil War had been preserved by a local business, who now use the building as their headquarters. I wanted to ask Barry about how it felt seeing the mural. So, when you first found out about the drawing, because it depicts, it's a big hammer, isn't it?
Yeah.
Smashing a swastika.
And I think it's the words "death to fascism" or something similar to that.
How did you feel when you first saw that?
Couldn't believe it, especially seeing my uncle's name, was say the start, or just before the pandemic. That's when we first saw the photograph. And what happened from that, they got the photograph and that of the old branch, and the first thing they said, we're sending you and Marlene out there to see that. And of course, the start of the pandemic, everything stopped it. So it was like, when we actually went, was probably 6, 7 years on. Well,
so you've just been to Spain, haven't you? You've been on a bit of an odyssey to go and see the drawing your dad did. So how was that? Because you started in France, didn't you? And you crossed over to Figueres. How did it, how was that whole experience following in your dad's footsteps? Well, to actually go and see the drawing, I can only talk about it because it was so emotional, which I never expected. Obviously, very proud because it's its own little bit of history, and I just felt that's my dad. And well, you can see, I was very close to my dad, and I knew about this, and I just thought, what a wonderful thing it would have been if he'd known it was still there, Because it's in a like a former farmhouse in it in Catalonia near the French border, and basically the company have got the building, and like the old farmhouse building, and renovated it and discovered this. It had been a former hospital during the Spanish Civil War, which your dad was in.
I didn't realise that, or whether it was just it obviously been converted, like But apparently, speaking to them about the place, because it's that look, it was owned by a very wealthy European family, and they bought land and all sorts. They gradually took over. I reckon you could spend maybe a couple of days talking to people from who knew a lot about it. It's funny, the guy who we met and who and give a little speech and made us welcome and everything about it. He's from Guildford.
But he lives in Spain.
He works. He said he must travel between the two places, But
and when you went to Catalonia and went to see the drawing, and you went into the former hospital, didn't you? And this company owned.
Yeah.
But how did like local people in the village, and how did people who worked for the company that now were in the building? What was it like when you got there?
We first met the mayor and one of his people who works on the council in the little village offices. That was where they had the museum upstairs as well. Small stuff where had been made, a lot of it by one of the woman that was there. They'd been met by her father, made all these items and that and everything. The welcome, you could feel that the feeling was they were really pleased that we'd managed to get there. I say we met them the morning before we went across to the building. The mayor and that, whose photographs with him, them that you saw in the book.
Yeah.
That really, for everybody we met there was so welcoming and interested. If I want such a blabber, we'll probably get a bit more information, but you can see I get, even now, get really emotional. I
think it's understandable.
I've only sort of had that feeling a couple of times in my life, where you feel like you're there, but you're not there. It was overwhelming in a way. They asked me to say a few words. I couldn't talk. It was massive. People might not understand it, but I felt so. I thought I'd be okay because of the time factor in all this happening, like from before the pandemic, from my dad singing the songs when he'd had a couple of pints, and stuff. I thought I'd be able to detach myself from it, but just being there and seeing these people who had asked to be there when we came, it was so overwhelming. When the stuff's going on around you and you're not taking it in, it was like that all the time,
What do you think, like, having seen everything, and I mean, the memorial in Hull is amazing as well, and it's really good that as a city you've got that. But what do you think why do you think it's important that people continue to commemorate the legacy of the people who went to Spain and your dad? And sort of, what does that mean for you?
Well, Marlene and myself go into the town probably 4 or 5 times a week. And we always go past the memorial, touch the memorial where my dad's name is. And that's never altered since the day it was put there. We've been, every time we go in, if we don't go in, we go before and we just touch it. You just feel like you brought a little bit of recognition.
Bert Wilson was not the only International Brigade volunteer from Hull. He was part of a small contingent from the city, and one of the estimated 2,300 British citizens who would fight on behalf of Spain's democratic government. To learn more about the Hull volunteers, I caught up with Andrew Young, a historian who's helped to uncover these remarkable stories and to establish the International Brigade Memorial in Hull.
Well, I got interested in the International Brigade volunteers quite a long time ago, far longer than I care to remember, actually. Must have been the 1980s. I was quite politically active at the time, and I think the first real sign of recognition of the International Brigade volunteers in Hull was when a plaque was unveiled in the Guildhall, and that was based on research that had been done by one of the sons of one of the Hull volunteers. And at the time, it was thought that there were 8 volunteers who went from Hull to Spain. We subsequently now know that there were more than 8 that went. But the original plaque that was unveiled in the Guildhall in 1990 just had the names of 8 volunteers. So I think I'd always had that interest, and I was working in the Guildhall at the time, so you couldn't fail to notice it on a daily basis walking through the corridors of the Guildhall. But I think things started to come together where there were a lot of disparate people in the city who were also interested in the volunteers. And I think things finally came to a head when somebody wrote a letter to the local paper saying that he was going to commemorate the International Brigade Volunteers, the plaque in the Guildhall, and he invited anybody who was interested to come along. Anyway, I went along, and when I got there must have been a room with about 30 people in it, and that represented people who were in trade unions, shop stewards, historians of a certain nature, but it also included relatives and friends of the volunteers. And I think it was through that that we started to build up a bit of a community, and the suggestion was put forward that we work towards fundraising for a bigger and more public memorial to the volunteers, and we worked towards that. So just a few years ago, we did fundraising in virtually no time at all. A lot of trade unions kind of donated, some individuals donated, people did sponsored charity events, and we got sufficient funds to commission a sculpture of a memorial, which is now in a very public and visible place in the centre of the city, and it's become a little bit of a rallying point for political events, and people quite rightly stop and ask questions about the Hull International Brigade volunteers and what their role was in going and fighting against fascism in the Spanish Civil War.
What motivated volunteers from Hull to go? I mean, it's a disparate group of people who went, but what are some of the things that motivate people to go in both Hull and internationally, I suppose?
Well, I think really it was what the UK was like in the 1930s. Politics, you could argue it's a little bit like that now, but it was starting to get very, very polarised between the left and the right. And of course, Mosley was on the march with his British Union of Fascists, and the socialist and communist movements were very quick in lots of cities to counter any momentum that the fascists were trying to gain, particularly among the working class. And it was no different in Hull, and the Trades Council was very active in being against fascism and Mosley. And in those days, the Communist Party was relatively quite strong, and it was very, very different from the Labour Party. But something fairly unique happened in Hull, in that there became almost a socialist coalition to fight fascism between the Labour Party membership, young Labour Party members, independent Labour Party members, which was distinctly different from the Labour Party at that time, and young communists in the city. And I've got lots of information, photographs, articles where those young people on the left were doing things collectively, both politically and socially. And I think things came to a head round about 1935-36 when Mosley kind of announced that he was going to have a rally at a place in Hull called Corporation Field, which was a big open piece of waste ground, really. Kind of rallies and events were held. So he came on the 12th of July 1936, and whether he was surprised or not, I don't know, but there was a crowd of about 10,000 people there to oppose him. And a lot of people have heard of the Battle of Cable Street, but not many have heard about the Battle of Corporation Field. But effectively, Mosley tried to speak on a podium. Somebody pulled the plug on his audio at the time, and he spoke for about 3 minutes before being stopped by the crowd. And effectively, he was rushed to a car. There's been talk that there was a bullet hole in the car, window that's never been properly verified, but it was reported at the time, and effectively he made his way out of the city. And I've got photographs from the event, and the most prominent people trying to put off Mosley, you can clearly see some of the International Brigade volunteers who later went to Spain that year or the year after.
You've worked with the families and worked with Barry over the years. How did you sort of get in contact with the relatives? Was that through the memorial committee? Or?
Some of it was, but in some cases, I did a bit of cold calling. And in Barry's case, I literally looked up some records online from births, marriages, and deaths. I'd found his dad. I found that he had a son called Barry, and I literally looked in the local phone book, which I had at the time, and I think there were two Barry Wilsons, and I think I probably flipped a coin as to which one I rang first, and I rang him, and I asked him whether he was the son of Bert Wilson. And typical of the Wilson family, I think, including his dad, he asked who wants to know. So I explained who I was, what I was doing, and I think it's fair to say that he was so chuffed that somebody was contacting him about his dad, and it became quite clear quite soon that he knew very little about what his dad had done politically and out in Spain, doing quite a lot of research by that time on the Hull volunteers, including using what are called the Moscow files, which, if anybody's ever seen them or you access them online, they're an incredible set of volumes of records of the international brigades, not just from Britain, but from all over the world. And from that, there were individual volunteers who filled out forms that were asking quite comprehensive questions about their employment, about how they became politically motivated, what kind of political pamphlets and leaflets they read. And I managed to find that particular form filled in for Barry's father.
In terms of other archival material, because you found all sorts about Hull, and like you mentioned earlier, the photographs. How did you go about finding that? Is it archives in Hull you've used? Or?
For the people of Hull, we have an absolutely fantastic history centre, and that history centre is jointly run by Hull City Council and the University of Hull. And a lot of people with historical records, they get handed down through families, but then at some point the family doesn't really know what to do with them. But you can actually bequeath them to the history centre. So what I was able to do was, alongside the volunteers, is to build up a bigger picture of what the left-wing politics in Hull looked like in the 90s, and it showed how active the Trades Council were. Obviously, the national hunger marches were going on at the time, so there was extreme poverty in Hull. And I was able to find out about the people who were linked to the International Brigade volunteers through friendships and membership of the same political parties.
And I know the volunteers, when we last met, all those years ago, we went to Paragon Station, and am I right in thinking that's where the volunteers left from, to when they went to...
Some of them left from Paragon Station, and would have, still do it today, would have probably changed trains at Doncaster and ended up down in London, then heading for the south coast and getting getting transport over to France. That's how most of them went. There are also other interesting stories in that one of the Hull volunteers, he was a journalist, and he'd worked his way up in the paper industry to be a journalist at the Daily Mirror, and he approached his bosses at the Daily Mirror and he said that he would like to go out to Spain and be the war correspondent for the war that was unfolding in Spain. But when he got out there, they let him go. They paid his fare, and when he got out there, he joined the International Brigades.
I know not all the Hull volunteers made it home back to Hull, did they? And at least, am I right in thinking at least 2 were killed?
Four were killed that we know of. We've done, the relatives of those 4 in their own way have done quite a lot of things to keep the memory alive of those volunteers. 2 of them, guys called Robert Wardle and James Bentley, were very, very close friends, and they went out to Spain together. And we thought that they were both killed on the same day in the same ambush by Italian infantry who were fighting on behalf of Franco. But we've just recently, literally within the last few months, discovered that James Bentley may well have survived that attack, but died later in hospital. But there is a memorial plaque in the town where they were both ambushed. One of the families placed that memorial a few years ago, and it's quite prominent and maintained by the locals.
I know that Bert was he ended up in a hospital, didn't he, in northern Spain, northern Catalonia.
Yeah.
Do you know the circumstances around why he ended up there?
That's less clear to us, actually. But many of the volunteers, when they went to the front, and he went out relatively quite late in the Civil War. But many of the volunteers on the front line will have got some kind of injuries, and so that's probably how he ended up in that hospital.
Why is it important, do you think, to keep telling this story and to raise awareness of the whole volunteers today?
Well, I think the thing is, for me, we're in the modern era, and most armies across the world, it's an occupation and a career. But these people, they had the courage of their conviction, their political conviction, and the clue is in the word volunteers. So they did everything that they possibly could to get out to Spain to fight against fascism, because that's genuinely what they thought was going to be the evil on the world. And in actual fact, for normal working class guys, they were proved completely right. Because we have to remember, during the Spanish Civil War, the British government remained neutral. It wouldn't take the side of the democratically elected republic. So in that sense, they were kind of acquiescing to Franco and fascism. And we all know what happened after 19th Germany and beyond, when fascism really did take a stranglehold all across Europe. So from that perspective, we all learn in history at school about the Second World War. But I don't think we learn enough about the build-up to the Second World War, and particularly what happened in Spain.
Spain's past is complex. Along winding roads I've walked for an hour, the smell of petrol and burst oranges mingling in the air, treading gravel through Valencia's Mediterranean hinterland. The cemetery is silent. Only a few old women bring flowers for the dead. Quietly, a coffin is brought in behind me. From the walls, cypress trees rise up, bathing us in shade, the living and the dead. This is Spain's dark secret, its whispered history. For the past year, I worked as an English teacher in the small Valencian city of Alzira. Here, the coastal mountains meet the flat wetlands and rice paddies that run south from Valencia. Pines and citrus mix with small factories and industrial units. Between May 1939 and January 1941, 211 people massacred in this cemetery by the victorious Franco regime following the Spanish Civil War. Now, a marble monument stands above the mass grave, commemorating the soldiers and civilians who lay below. The brutality of Spain's civil war still casts a long shadow over communities in the country. I wanted to understand how the conflict began and why so many individuals took up arms in defence of Spain's Second Republic. To learn more, I met up with Peter Anderson, Professor of 20th-century Spanish history at the University of Leeds, one of the world's foremost historians of modern Spain. Peter, please can you give me a little bit about the background of the Spanish Civil War?
So the Spanish Civil War started in July 1936, and the origins go back a long way in time, but we can probably start in 1931 when a new political system starts in Spain, which is called the Second Republic. And the Second Republic had a reforming government, wanted to reform landholding, so they wanted to redistribute land from big landowners to small holding peasants or landless labourers. They wanted to reform the relationship between the state and the church. So the church had a lot of control over issues like education, film censorship, and a whole series of other issues. And there were a lot of people who wanted to reduce the influence of the church. The Republic also wanted to reform the relationship with the army. So the army in Spain had a long history of intervening in politics, imposing political rulers, repressing members of trade unions by putting them on trial in military courts. And the Second Republic also wanted to change the relationship between the state and the regions. So they were thinking and considering and debating about devolving power to people around the Barcelona area in Catalonia, people around the Bilbao area in the Basque Country, and some of the other areas of Spain like Galicia, which has its own language. So these were areas which had been crying out for reform for years and years and years, but the political systems that had been in place in Spain before 1931 were largely controlled by people who didn't want those kinds of reforms. So important people in the army, Spanish nationalists who didn't like the regions having more power, people very close to the church, and large landowners. So when the Second Republic came along, this was an immense shock to these people. And basically what we see in the period between 1931 and 1936 is Spain dividing into two broad camps. Obviously it's more complicated than that, but we can see two broad camps that are very badly divided. And that feeds into international politics at this time, because we also see the rise of fascism. So Mussolini is already in power in Italy. Hitler comes into power in January 1933. And for some people on the right, fascism is an inspiration. Maybe this is the solution for getting rid of the Second Republic. And for people on the centre and the left, fascism is a terrible threat. They really don't want that to happen. So this really makes the situation much tenser. And what happens in July 1936 is that the army, or elements of the army, particularly around General Franco, ally with lots of civilian groups on the right and a number of fascist groups and start an armed uprising against the Second Republic. Lots of people on the left and the centre of politics are really frightened by this because they think it can lead to fascism and the destruction of democracy and all of the reforms that they had believed in. So large numbers of armed workers take on these rebels in the streets. So armed workers seize weapons, they start fighting them, and the attempted coup is rather botched. So some parts of Spain go over to the Francoists or the rebels, and some parts of Spain go over to the Second Republic. Now, at the beginning of the Civil War in July 1936, most people thought it was a failed coup and it wouldn't really succeed, and they expected the government, because it controlled the army, to be successful. But what happens next is that Mussolini and Hitler send troops, planes, and equipment to Spain, and they turn what was a botched coup into a full-scale civil war, which is going to last until the end of March 1939, when Franco, with the support of Mussolini and Hitler, finally triumphs against the Second Republic.
And in terms of the international brigades, why did people come to join them, and why were people motivated to come and fight in a conflict in defence of a Republican government within Spain?
Yeah, so Spain was quite an unusual country in the early 1930s because lots of countries at this time across Europe were turning to fascism. Italy had already turned to fascism. Germany had. There was a great fear of fascism and that democracy was collapsing. Yet in Spain, you seem to have the opposite process. You had a democratic government, and not just any democratic government, a democratic government which was reforming the relationship between state and the armed forces, between the state and the church. And Spain became a symbol of reform, and particularly education reform. So a lot of people in Spain had been illiterate, there'd been hardly any education. The Second Republic set up an enormous program of school building and literacy campaigns, and this really became iconic among groups on the left. So people are worried about the rise of fascism. Spain seems like a wonderful example of the defense of democracy. We also have to look at international relations. So in 1935, Mussolini had invaded Ethiopia. People had seen this as possibly the start of a trail towards a Second World War, and that if fascism wasn't stopped in its tracks, then the inevitable would be Second World War with millions of people killed on a far worse scale, a far greater scale than had happened in the Second World War. So people around Europe and around the world were really concerned about the rise of fascism, the defense of democracy, and the need to stop a Second World War. So when the revolt starts in Spain, it immediately jumps from being just a civil war in a faraway country about which nobody really cared into becoming the cause in the world at the moment that summed up all of the tensions between democracy, fascism, and fear of war. So that was what a lot of people felt. And when they saw how their governments reacted, I think a lot of people became increasingly angry. So most famously of all, the British and French governments followed a policy of non-intervention in the Spanish Civil War. And what they wanted, from their point of view, was for civil war not to spread to other European countries. So they were worried about Spain inflaming the situation in Europe. And from the British and French government point of view, they felt they weren't militarily ready to enter a conflict if it broke out. So they wanted also to win time. A lot of ordinary people, though, felt that this was a betrayal of democracy, because the Second Republic, for instance, under non-intervention, wasn't able to purchase weapons on the international arms market, or from countries like Britain and France, in order to defend itself against fascism, whereas Franco was being armed by Hitler and Mussolini. So a lot of people felt that this was a really terrible situation. And the 1930s is a really important time because it's a time when people feel they personally have to make a difference. They have to do something about this terrible situation, and that they can do something about it. So this is the context in which a lot of people volunteer to go to Spain. And if we look at who volunteered, we take the case of the British volunteers. A lot of them came from trade union organizations and from a trade union background. So a lot of them had grown up in communities where they mixed with other people who were interested in defending the rights of workers. Some of them might have gone to institutions like the Workers' Education Association, where they became interested in foreign politics, international politics. A lot of them in the workplace realized that unless you were in an organization, you could suffer discrimination or you might suffer low wages. And they'd begun to realize that the domestic struggle for trade union rights, for better wages, for better education, was deeply linked to the international situation, because fascism, just as fascism was a threat to democracy in Spain, fascism was a threat to democracy, to workers' rights, to workers' wages, to women's equality, or women's right to the vote. All of these things were at stake in Spain. And I think that's a situation in which we can understand why tens of thousands of people from across Europe and from across the world volunteered to fight in Spain.
And following the war, you've worked extensively on the aftermath within Spain and the memory of the Civil War. What happened to former International Brigade veterans, and within Spain as well? What happened? What were some of the repercussions that people felt after Franco won the war?
Yeah, so some of the International Brigade volunteers were captured by Franco, and some of them were imprisoned. A number of them were executed. The British government, somewhat reluctantly, worked to try and release some of those people, and they returned to the United Kingdom. A lot of the other brigaders returned, particularly after October 1938, to the United Kingdom. Some of them were given a heroic welcome when they arrived in the United Kingdom, so there was a big parade and the Victoria train station and Trafalgar Square, and they were kind of rather heroic as examples of people who'd stood up to fascism and put their own lives on the line. A lot of them return to their communities where they become involved in trade union work and so on. And then, of course, shortly afterwards, the Second World War breaks out. A lot of them volunteer because they want to take part in this war now against the British government. Finally seems to have joined the war against fascism. A number of them suffer discrimination in the British Armed Services because they're considered to be suspect because they might be communist. Some of them aren't, for this reason, aren't given certain positions or sent to certain places and are sent to rather less important scenes, if you like. But some of them become involved in important action. They've got frontline action experience, which is valued. It's particularly interesting in the case of the United States, where the special services there took on a number of volunteers to train people in guerrilla warfare and so on. So they have a rather mixed reception in the Second World War. Afterwards, the history of the International Brigade is one that dims and then becomes brighter at some times. So the International Brigade veterans set up their own association, which was exclusively for them, and they became involved in some very important campaigns. For example, they always were very interested in the Franco regime and the fact that the Franco regime, unlike Hitler and Mussolini, survived the Second World War. So Franco was very much the dictator who got away. So they campaigned vigorously against Franco when a lot of other people on the British left weren't. For example, they sent observers when there were trials of left-wing activists in Spain. They mounted a number of campaigns, including one against going on holiday to Franco's Spain, because they said people who did that, and people in their millions did that, were keeping in power a fascist tyrant, if you like. At the same time, the history of the international brigades was really a heroic memory for a lot of people on the left, and particularly after 1956, Khrushchev in the Soviet Union gave a speech in which he outlined all of the horrors that had taken place under Stalin, and communism, particularly in the climate of the Cold War, was deeply discredited. Yet on the other hand, the international brigades offered a slightly different history, not a history of Stalinism and not a history necessarily of communism, but the history of Democrats standing up to fascism. And in that context, I think the international brigaders and the veterans became seen in a much more positive light. And it was a history that the left-wing groups and trade unions could celebrate a lot. And I think when the Vietnam War started, I think a lot of international brigade veterans could identify with this war. So it was an unpopular war carried out by an unpopular government in which public opinion was very much against the United States and so on. So I think that gave a new breath of life, if you like. But one of the big moments for international brigaders is 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher is in power and attacking ferociously trade union rights and trade union organisations. And in that context, the international brigades become heroes of good trade union activists in a good battle who risk their own lives in the fight against fascism, if you like. This also coincides with a time when a lot of the veterans are beginning to age and to pass away. So if you put those two things together, you get a large memorial culture that emerges in the 1980s, and that's when we see lots of the memorials to the International Brigade veterans, such as the one in Leeds Town Hall or the one on the South Bank in London. These really emerge out of this context. And since then, I think the International Brigades have become more widely known about by people in British society, and particularly as the Cold War fades from people's memory. That vilification of people from the Communist Party from the left has rather died down. And I think people are much more interested in the individual stories of these rather brave people who put their lives on the line in the fight against fascism and were rather left out of the story of the Second World War and the fight against fascism, if you like. So I think there's a kind of reckoning with the past when people are saying, well, actually, it's not just about the Second World War, the fight against Hitler and fascism, it's also about the Spanish Civil War. So that's broadly the position in the United Kingdom and a lot of countries like the United States. The position in Spain is really different because Spain is governed and dominated by Franco until 1975, and that really gives Franco the chance to dominate the writing of history, the production of the historical narrative. And the historical narrative of the Francoists is that the International Brigade volunteers were basically unemployed people who were socially dysfunctional. They might be alcoholics, or they might not get on with their wives, they might have been divorced many times, who were tricked by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to go in to fight in Spain in an attack on the Catholic sacred values of Spain. So they were vilified quite badly in Spain. And there are a whole series of publications by Franquist army officers and Franquist civil servants which reproduce literally in those terms that they were dupes and that they were social misfits and that they were involved in the destruction of civilization. And it was very hard to organize alternative viewpoints in Spain. When Franco died in 1975, there was a gradual transition to democracy. But it wasn't a rupture and a decisive break with Francoism, because a lot of the people who'd been powerful in the armed forces or in the court system or in universities continued in place, and the left never won a decisive electoral victory, which allowed them to replace those people in power. So it was a time of compromise when it was very difficult to talk about the past, and a lot of people preferred instead to look to the future. And in that context, it became quite hard to talk about International Brigade volunteers, at least at the national and the level of centre politics. But if you go to the regions, what you can see is small groups on the left who are able to find marginal spaces to commemorate the International Brigade volunteers. And what the International Brigade volunteers become is a useful way of talking about the Spanish Civil War dead. So it was next to impossible to talk about people from the left from Spain who'd been murdered by the Franco regime because it was too politically contentious. But in the regions, and not by central and high political figures, like the Prime Minister, but lower down, people could talk about International Brigade volunteers, and they became a symbol or a proxy for talking about the Spanish Civil War dead. So what you see is the start of quite a few memorials, sort of some in Barcelona, for example, to International Brigade volunteers, and people on the left invite some of the International Brigade volunteers from Germany, from the United Kingdom, to Spain. And this, again, it's a way of focusing on the international dimension of the Spanish Civil War in order to talk about the Civil War past. And then really from the year 2000, a lot of people on the left feel much more confident, and they start to exhume some of the people who were murdered by the Franco regime, and they start to talk about some of the things that happened. And this is when a lot of people from the international brigades start to help them, to give them support, and to join the struggle for the recognition of Spanish victims of the Francoist repression, and not just international victims. So they played a really important and very interesting role in Spanish history and politics, and now they're much more recognised. I think a crucial moment came in 1995 when the British film director Ken Loach released a film called Land and Freedom, which talks in part about the International Brigade. And one of the phenomenons that happened there, or one of the phenomena, was that lots of young people went to see this film, young Spanish people went to see this film, and when they came out of the cinema, the first thing they said was, "Why didn't I know anything about this story of the International Brigade?"
I'm back in Hull with Barry. On the wall of his family home is a framed poem, written by his friend Dave Tuck. Before I left, I asked Barry if he could read that poem.
No pasaran. They went because their eyes could see no other way. How can we celebrate our heroes and heroines? How do we remember those that went to Spain to fight Franco and his fascists? From Madrid, Cordoba, Urama, Balset, Calais, and many other battles, the British battalion fought on many fronts alongside the Republican Army, many laying down their lives. We have our local heroes. It was our fathers, our brothers, our uncles, and our friends. It's beneath their quiet exteriors, the principles that drove them on. How can we give sufficient thanks to Bert Wilson, Joe Lattis, Jack Atkinson, Jim Bentley, Maurice Miller, Robert Wardle, Richard Mortimer, and Sam Walter? We are humbled by their bravery, their principles, and their sacrifices. We can hardly imagine their heroism as they would walk down dusty lanes far away from home towards a battlefront, towards the killing fields, there to face the gunfire and tanks and the aeroplanes. Death stared them in the face, and as they fought to build a better, fairer world for all of us, do we not look at the International Brigade with tremendous pride? In later years, you would perhaps pass by those that came back without a second glance and could never imagine they fought in a bloody war for you. You for all of us. How do we make sure that are not forgotten? Their principles, carry them forward, and the baton needs to be carried by further generations, echoing the battle cry in defence of Madrid. No pasarán. They shall not pass. They will not pass from our memories or our hearts. No passarin. Not then, not now, not ever.